Nobody remembered Marcus's name. Not because he was new. Not because he was bad at his job. Not because he didn't show up. Marcus had worked at Bellridge Manufacturing for almost 9 years. He arrived before most people. He stayed after most people left. He knew where the old inventory records were stored, which suppliers always delivered late, which machines made strange noises before breaking down, and which reports never matched what was actually happening on the factory floor. But nobody listened to him. He was quiet. He didn't interrupt meetings. He didn't laugh loudly at the CEO's jokes. He didn't play office politics. He didn't talk about promotions, vacations, expensive cars, or who was getting fired next. So people treated him like furniture. Useful furniture. Invisible furniture. Until the day the company was 48 hours away from collapse. That was the day everyone suddenly remembered Marcus's name. And it was also the day the people who had ignored, mocked, and dismissed him had to stand in front of the entire company and admit that the quiet employee they had overlooked was the only reason they still had jobs. Welcome back to Calm Verdict Stories. If you enjoy powerful stories about workplace karma, quiet success, betrayal, respect, and life lessons, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because today's story is for anyone who has ever done good work in silence while louder people got all the credit. My name is Marcus. When I joined Bellridge Manufacturing, I was 26 years old and grateful just to have a steady job. Bellridge made commercial refrigeration components for grocery chains, warehouses, hospitals, and restaurants. The company had been around for almost 40 years. It had a large factory outside the city, 3 regional warehouses, and hundreds of employees. I was hired as a data operations assistant. That title sounded more impressive than the job actually was. Mostly, I cleaned up inventory records, checked shipping data, compared invoices, fixed spreadsheet errors, and made sure different departments were using the same numbers. It was the kind of job no one noticed when things were working. But if I made one mistake, everyone noticed immediately. At first, I didn't mind. I liked the work. I liked patterns. I liked numbers. I liked seeing a mess and slowly figuring out why it existed. My manager, a man named Carl, told me during my first week, if you want to survive here, keep your head down and make your boss look good. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. Carl had been at Bellridge for 15 years. He was smart, but he was also lazy in a very polished way. He knew how to speak confidently in meetings without actually solving anything. He knew how to take credit for projects he barely understood. And he knew how to make sure blame always rolled downhill. The first time I created a system that reduced reporting errors, Carl presented it at the monthly leadership meeting as our department's new strategy. He didn't mention my name. I was sitting in the room. He pointed at one of my charts and said, I noticed there was an efficiency issue, so I put together a process to correct it. Everyone congratulated him. After the meeting, he walked past my desk and said, Good work. Keep it up. That was it. No credit. No acknowledgement. No raise. I told myself it didn't matter. I was young. I was learning. Maybe that was just how companies worked. But then it happened again. And again. A shipping report I built saved the company thousands in rush delivery fees. Carl took credit. A supplier tracking system I created helped the warehouse team avoid running out of a major component. Carl took credit. A dashboard I built showed that one of our regional warehouses was losing inventory through repeated scanning mistakes. Carl took credit. After 3 years, I had become very good at making Carl look competent. And people started treating him like a rising star. He got invited to executive meetings. He got a larger office. He got promoted to director of operations. I got a new title too. Senior Data Coordinator. It came with a tiny raise and more work. Meanwhile, a new executive joined the company. Her name was Vanessa. She came from a major consulting firm and arrived with a reputation for modernizing underperforming organizations. She wore sharp suits, spoke in phrases like operational alignment and strategic transformation, and had a way of making every room feel like an audition. At first, everyone loved her. The CEO, Martin Bellridge, especially loved her. Martin was the founder's son. He had inherited the company after his father retired. He was charming, ambitious, and obsessed with making Bellridge look bigger than it was. Vanessa told him everything he wanted to hear. She said Bellridge could double its revenue within 5 years. She said the company was being held back by old systems and fear-based management. She said she could lead a transformation. Martin gave her a huge budget. Carl immediately attached himself to her. Suddenly, every meeting became about innovation. Every department had to submit performance plans. Every process had to be streamlined. And every employee was expected to smile while doing the work of 2 people. Vanessa's first major decision was to replace the company's inventory software. The old system was outdated, yes. But it was stable. It had years of history. It connected to suppliers, warehouses, production schedules, and shipping records. The new system was flashy. It had a beautiful interface. It had dashboards, alerts, forecasting tools, and presentation-ready graphics. It also had problems. Major problems. I noticed them within the first month. The new software was importing inventory data incorrectly. Small quantities were being rounded down. Some supplier codes were being duplicated. Warehouse transfers were showing up twice in some reports and not at all in others. At first, the errors seemed minor. A few missing parts here. A few incorrect totals there. But I knew those numbers would grow. I brought my findings to Carl. He barely looked at them. Vanessa's team spent months on this rollout, he said. You're probably reading the report wrong. I checked it against physical inventory, I said. The data doesn't match. Carl sighed. Marcus, this is why you need to stop obsessing over tiny details. We're trying to move forward. I said, these details could cause production shortages. He leaned back in his chair. Do you know what happens when you keep bringing people problems without solutions? I have solutions. Then make a spreadsheet. Don't bother leadership. That was the end of the conversation. So I made the spreadsheet. Then another. Then a full report showing exactly where the mismatches were happening. I sent it to Carl. He never responded. A month later, I saw him in a meeting with Vanessa and Martin. He was presenting a slide about data noise during the software transition. He used my report. But he had changed the conclusion. Instead of warning them about a serious inventory problem, he said the differences were temporary variances that would resolve naturally. Vanessa nodded. Martin smiled. And the meeting moved on. I sat in the back, invisible as usual. For the next 6 months, the company looked successful from the outside. Vanessa's new dashboards showed improved efficiency. Martin talked about growth in interviews. Carl got praised for keeping operations stable during the transition. But on the factory floor, things were getting worse. Workers started receiving incomplete materials for production runs. Warehouse staff complained that the system said parts were available when the shelves were empty. Suppliers called asking why invoices were delayed. Customers began receiving shipments late. At first, management blamed individual departments. Then they blamed vendors. Then they blamed the economy. But the truth was simpler. The company didn't know what it actually had. And when a manufacturing company doesn't know what it has, it can't promise customers what it can deliver. I kept tracking the errors. Every day, I updated my private records. I didn't do it because I wanted to prove anyone wrong. I did it because I was scared. Bellridge employed hundreds of people. My father had worked at a factory before he retired. My sister's husband worked in a warehouse. I knew what it meant when a company started losing major accounts. It wasn't just executives who suffered. It was families. Then came the call that changed everything. Bellridge's largest customer was a national grocery chain called North Star Markets. They accounted for almost 30% of the company's annual revenue. North Star had placed a massive order for refrigeration components before the summer season. The deadline was tight, but Bellridge had promised delivery. The system showed we had enough inventory. Vanessa approved the production schedule. Carl sent confirmation emails. Martin personally called North Star's CEO to assure him everything was on track. But 2 weeks before the deadline, the factory manager discovered that a critical component was missing. Not low. Missing. The system said we had 18,000 units. The warehouse had 1,900. Someone had duplicated an old transfer record during the migration, and the error had been copied forward for months. Without those components, we couldn't complete North Star's order. Without North Star's order, Bellridge would lose millions. And without that revenue, the bank could trigger a review of the company's credit agreement. Suddenly, the tiny details were no longer tiny. The executive team called an emergency meeting. For the first time in years, I was invited. Not because anyone wanted my input. Because they needed someone to pull the data. I walked into the conference room at 7 a.m. Martin was pale. Vanessa had 3 laptops open. Carl looked angry, but not at himself. At me. He glanced at the reports in my hands and said, "Marcus, we need accurate numbers. Not theories." I looked at him. Then I put my folders on the table. I have accurate numbers. Vanessa folded her arms. Can you confirm the warehouse count? Yes. And can you tell us when the discrepancy began? Yes. How? I've been tracking it since the system went live. The room went quiet. Carl stared at me. Martin leaned forward. You knew about this? I knew there were errors, I said. I reported them several times. Carl quickly said, he raised general concerns. We addressed them. I looked at Martin. I sent reports. I can show you the dates. Vanessa's expression changed. Not to guilt. To fear. Because she finally understood that the problem wasn't new. It had been ignored. Martin asked me, can you fix it? Everyone looked at me. For 9 years, I had been the quiet person in the corner who fixed problems before anyone noticed them. But this one was bigger. I took a breath and said, I can't create inventory that doesn't exist. But I may be able to help us find it. They looked confused. I pulled up a map of all warehouse transfers from the past 8 months. I had compared system records with freight scans, supplier invoices, and maintenance logs from the warehouse loading docks. There are 3 possibilities, I said. The parts were never delivered, they were delivered and scanned incorrectly, or they were moved to another location and lost in the system. Carl said, we already checked the warehouses. You checked the current inventory reports, I said. I checked physical movement. No one spoke. I pointed to one location. A closed distribution annex 2 hours away. Bellridge had stopped using it after a storm damaged part of the roof. The official records showed it had been emptied months ago. But freight scans showed deliveries still going there. Not many. Just enough to matter. Vanessa looked at the operations manager. Is that possible? He shook his head slowly. It shouldn't be. I said, that's exactly why no one checked. Martin stood up. Get a team there now. Carl tried to take control. I'll go. Martin looked at him. Then he looked at me. Marcus, you go. For the first time in 9 years, Carl had nothing to say. I drove to the annex with the warehouse manager, 2 technicians, and a security supervisor. The building looked abandoned from the outside. Broken fencing. Dirty windows. A faded loading dock sign. We had to cut through an overgrown patch of weeds to reach one of the side entrances. Inside, it was dark. Dust covered everything. The roof had leaked in one section, but the back storage area was dry. And there they were. Pallet after pallet after pallet of the missing components. Nearly 17,000 units. They had been delivered during the software transition. The scans had gone through, but the system tagged them to the wrong location. No one noticed because the annex was supposed to be empty. I stood there for a moment, staring at those pallets. Not because I was happy. Because I was angry. Angry that hundreds of people had spent months panicking, blaming each other, and working overtime because a problem had been dismissed when it could have been fixed early. But anger wasn't useful now. We had less than 48 hours. I called Martin. We found them, I said. There was silence on the other end. Then he said, how many? Enough to complete North Star's order. I could hear people talking behind him. Then Martin said, get them moving. For the next 2 days, I barely slept. We organized trucks. We inspected the parts. We rerouted production. We called vendors. We kept the factory running through the night. The warehouse workers were incredible. The technicians were incredible. The drivers were incredible. People who had been ignored by management for months suddenly came together because they understood what was at stake. North Star's order left the factory with 4 hours to spare. The company survived. But the crisis didn't disappear just because the shipment left. Martin ordered an internal review. The board got involved. Vanessa tried to say the issue was caused by unforeseeable transition challenges. Carl said he had delegated data validation responsibilities. Which was a polished way of saying he wanted to blame me. But this time, I had records. Every email. Every spreadsheet. Every report. Every time I had raised the issue. Every time Carl ignored it. Every time Vanessa's team dismissed it as a temporary variance. The board asked me to present my findings. I was terrified. Public speaking was never my strength. I would rather spend 12 hours fixing data than 5 minutes speaking to executives. But I knew what would happen if I stayed quiet again. So I presented. I didn't insult Carl. I didn't accuse Vanessa. I showed dates. I showed numbers. I showed patterns. I explained what had happened, how it had been ignored, and what the company needed to change so it would never happen again. When I finished, nobody clapped. Nobody spoke for almost a full minute. Then the board chair asked Carl one question. Why didn't you act on these reports? Carl looked at me. Then he looked at the board. And for once, he didn't have a polished answer. Vanessa resigned 2 weeks later. Carl was removed from his position the following month. But that wasn't the part that mattered to me. The part that mattered happened at the company-wide meeting. Martin stood on a stage in the factory cafeteria. Hundreds of employees were there. Warehouse workers. Drivers. Technicians. Office staff. Supervisors. People who had been working late for months without knowing whether the company would survive. Martin spoke about the crisis. He admitted that leadership had failed. He admitted that important warnings had been ignored. Then he called me to the stage. My hands were shaking as I walked up. Martin looked at the crowd and said, "For years, Marcus was one of the most overlooked employees in this company. He noticed problems no one else wanted to see. He raised concerns that leadership failed to take seriously. And when this company was facing a disaster, he found the answer. The room was silent. Then Martin turned toward Carl, who was standing near the side of the room. And he said, "We also owe Marcus an apology." Carl looked like he wanted to disappear. Martin handed him the microphone. For a second, Carl didn't move. Then he walked forward. He looked at me. "I took credit for your work," he said. "I dismissed your warnings. I treated you like you were only useful when I needed something fixed. And I nearly cost this company everything because I cared more about looking competent than listening." His voice shook. "I'm sorry." Then Martin looked at the entire company. "And I'm sorry too," he said. "I allowed a culture where loud people were rewarded and careful people were ignored. That changes now." The applause started from the warehouse section. Then the technicians stood. Then the office staff. And suddenly, the entire cafeteria was clapping. I didn't know what to do. I had spent 9 years trying not to be noticed. Now everyone was looking at me. But for the first time, it didn't feel like pressure. It felt like respect. 3 months later, Martin offered me the role of Vice President of Operations and Systems. I almost said no. Not because I didn't want it. Because I was afraid. Afraid that I would become like Carl. Afraid that I would start caring more about titles than people. Afraid that I would forget what it felt like to sit quietly in a meeting while someone else took credit for your work. But then I thought about the warehouse workers who had helped save North Star's order. I thought about the technicians who had worked all night. I thought about every quiet person who had ever been ignored because they didn't know how to make noise. So I accepted. But I made a promise to myself. No employee would have to fight to be heard just because they weren't the loudest person in the room. We changed the reporting system. We created anonymous escalation channels. We required leadership to respond to documented operational risks within 48 hours. We built cross-department teams where warehouse workers, drivers, technicians, and office staff could speak directly to decision-makers. And the company changed. Not overnight. Not perfectly. But it changed. A year later, Bellridge was more profitable than it had been in a decade. But more importantly, people trusted each other again. And sometimes, when I walk through the factory floor, a new employee will stop me and say, "I heard what happened. I heard you saved the company." I always tell them the same thing. I didn't save it alone. Because I didn't. The quiet employee didn't save the company. The people who were finally listened to saved the company. Marcus, the data coordinator. The warehouse manager. The drivers. The technicians. The people who had been doing the real work all along. The lesson is simple. Never underestimate the quiet person in the room. They may not speak often. They may not demand attention. They may not know how to sell themselves. But they are watching. They are learning. They are noticing the things everyone else is too busy talking to see. And one day, when everything falls apart, they may be the only person who knows how to put it back together. Thank you for watching Calm Verdict Stories. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment below. Have you ever been ignored at work, only for people to realize later that you were right? Subscribe for more stories about workplace karma, career growth, office politics, respect, and life lessons. Until next time, stay focused, stay humble, and never underestimate the quiet person in the room.